Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing a season recap for the 22-23 San Jose Sharks. Now, as we know, this was one of the worst seasons in San Jose Sharks history, and also one of the most embarrassing, disappointing, tough-to-watch seasons in this franchise 30-plus year history. Now, the major question is, how did we get here? How did we arrive at this point? What exactly happened to get to this point where the Sharks would end up with a record of 22-44-16 for fourth last in the league? Well, our story actually starts at the beginning of last year, as longtime general manager Doug Wilson would step away from the team due to medical reasons, and assistant general manager Joe Will would step in as interim GM for the rest of that year. And his major move that he would make is extending the contract of Tomas Hertl to an 8-year deal worth over $8 million per year. Once the end of the season arrived, he would be stepping out, as the Sharks would look for their longtime replacement GM, and a couple of days before the NHL entry draft, they would arrive at Mike Grier, and so he would be brought in. His first sort of move would be to handle the very important 2022 draft, and he would immediately make a splash. The Sharks would come into that draft with the 11th overall pick, and they would leave with their highest pick being 27th overall, as Mike Grier would decide to trade down and play more of a quantity over quality situation at this draft, and this was an extremely controversial move at the time. Moving down 16 spots when you already have the 11th overall pick is pretty crazy, though now it does seem to be paying some potential dividends, as a lot of hype is beginning to build up from Sharks fans over that 27th overall pick, Philip Bystedt, and even a couple of the other picks picked below him, like Matthias Havelid as well. So we'll see over the next couple of years how that will pan out. But the major thing that we got from that entry draft was that Mike Grier was willing to make these aggressive type of moves. Now, there were also many other moves that he would make to try and leave his stamp on this team. He wouldn't re-sign Jonathan Dahlen, who had a pretty solid rookie campaign with the San Jose Sharks. He would buy out the contract of Rudolph Balcers. He would trade longtime star defenseman Brent Burns to the Carolina Hurricanes, and he'd also bring in a few of his own guys who he would want to try and build the type of culture that he wanted going for the San Jose Sharks, picking up players like Matt Benning, Luke Cunnin, Nico Sturm, Steven Lorentz. This was generally to try and bolster a different type of idea of how the San Jose Sharks would play the game. However, by the end of the offseason, the major question that we could ask was, did the Sharks actually improve? And the answer to that question seemed to be no, even though Mike Grier, as you would expect, came in saying, we're not going to go for a rebuild. The moves that he would make it seem as though they were kind of going for a rebuild, because the Sharks would finish 11th last year, and now they're getting worse, so you would expect a worse result, and a worse result we did end up getting. And this one starts off the season with 2 games in the Czech Republic versus the Nashville Predators, and the Sharks would lose both of those games. In fact, they would lose the first 5 games of this season in extremely embarrassing fashion, showing off as being one of the worst teams in the league just watching those first 5 games, and their first win would only come in Game 6 in overtime against the New York Rangers. But they would never recover from the massive hole that they would find themselves in from the beginning of this season. As the first couple of months would move on, by the time we'd arrive at the Christmas break, where usually most of the playoff teams are pretty much set, the Sharks would find themselves 5th last in the league. However, 5th last in the league still had them with a pretty significant lead over the other 4 teams below them. In fact, they were a full 8 points ahead of last place Chicago, as well as 6 points ahead of Columbus and Anaheim, who were in 31st and 30th. And so while it seemed as though the Sharks were one of the worst teams in the league, they didn't necessarily seem to be in that same category as the really explicitly tanking teams like the Ducks and like the Chicago Blackhawks. However, once we got through January, February, March, the Sharks somehow hit an unexpected new low. In fact, there was about a 2-month stretch where the Sharks had the worst record in the entire league by a multiple point margin. I feel as though it was something like they had generated 5 points over that span, while the next closest team was something at like 9 or 10. And so while it seemed as though the Sharks would not be able to fall that much further than 5th or 4th last, they eventually found themselves last place in the entire league with just a few weeks to play, which at this point was viewed as a positive because the season was already entirely lost, and the Sharks were just hoping to try and get a very good high pick. And if you can get that first overall pick, you could get Connor Bedard, which would be viewed as a huge win for the franchise. However, even after this awful stretch of games, the San Jose Sharks, they had just a bit of oomph left in them, and they rattled off 3 wins in a row. They put up 7 points in a 4-game stretch, so 7 of a possible 8 points, which would jump them from that last place spot all the way back to 4th last in the league. And while it would eventually become very close as the Blue Jackets, the Blackhawks would accumulate some points here or there, eventually the Sharks would indeed finish the season with that 4th last spot. You see, when you win 3 games, when you get 7 of a possible 8 points over a 4-game stretch, and you're competing with teams like the Anaheim Ducks, who will lose 13 in a row to end the season, it's very difficult to actually find yourself back below them in the standings. 4th last, still a pretty solid draft position, but not as good as it could have been. So that's how it went. That's what happened in the season. But why did this happen? Well, if we take a look at the Sharks roster, it's not that much of a surprise. The Sharks came into this season with just 4 top 6 forwards. That would be Timo Meier, Tomas Hertl, Logan Couture, and Alex Barabanov. And even Barabanov is not in the same top 6 category as a player like Timo Meier. Also, as we know, through in this season, Timo Meier, while he started off amazing, the Sharks would eventually end up trading him at a point near the beginning of March, near that trade deadline, to the New Jersey Devils, and they wouldn't necessarily get much help back in terms of actual roster immediately. The only roster player that they got back was Fabian Zetterlund, and I can tell you that Fabian Zetterlund was significantly worse than Timo Meier. In fact, he didn't even have a single goal to end the season with the San Jose Sharks, so they got significantly worse with that deal, and were left with just 3 top 6 forwards right after. And the rest of the roster, the other 8 forwards players playing in that top 12, there were no young, creative type of players. You were filling the roster with players like Nick Bonino, Matt Nieto, Steven Lorentz, Evgeny Svechnikov, and there's nothing wrong with any of these players necessarily, but they're not going to be potential difference makers. You know that at best they're going to put up like 10 goals in a season, and that's that. And so there really wasn't much variance from many of the Sharks forwards, and so it's not a surprise that they would have some issues actually scoring. And on the defensive side, it's a similar thing. You had Erik Karlsson leading the way, and then you were bringing in 5 other defensemen who would probably not even be top 4 defensemen on any other team or most other teams in the NHL. Matt Benning, Marc-Edouard Vlasic, Jacob Megna, Radim Shemek, Mario Ferraro. The only player who even had like borderline top 4 talent, at least expected-wise, would be Mario Ferraro. But after last season, where he was very disappointing, you're probably not expecting much, and what happened this year was that indeed he was quite bad. And while Vlasic and Benning ended up having pretty surprising seasons which made them serviceable top 4 defensemen, it definitely wasn't enough, especially with the goaltending situation that the Sharks ended up happening, though I'll get to that a bit later. Now, having said all this, there is some talk about how the stats would go to show that the Sharks were a better team than they actually showed, and that could definitely be argued. In fact, when we take a look at a stat like expected goals, the San Jose Sharks were near the middle of the pack in terms of this statistics. They certainly weren't in the playoffs, but they were relatively close, much more in the Vancouver or Ottawa range compared to the Chicago or Columbus range. Now, what ended up happening is that the Sharks scored significantly less goals than they were expected. So basically, based on the chances that they got, they scored less goals than you would think, and they also gave up a lot more goals than they were expected based on the chances that they gave up. Now, this is a combination of, yes, some bad luck, but also the fact that a lot of the Sharks forwards didn't have much of that finishing touch. A lot of them were like that Noah Gregor, or when Mikey Eyssimont was on the team, also had the issues finishing, as well as a lot of issues, again, with the goaltending, which I will get to a bit later. And so in the end, the Sharks, they found themselves 4th last, and that really wasn't that much of a surprise based on how they played and looking at the roster on paper. Now let us move on to the players here that led the way for the San Jose Sharks, and obviously the major highlight, really the only highlight of the season, was Erik Karlsson. And I'm not even sure which of these statistics is more impressive, the fact that he managed to put up 101 points as a defenseman, or the fact that he actually managed to play the entire season and stay healthy for that entire year at 82 games played. Both of these are not expected, having led into this season, and yet Erik Karlsson was just an absolute juggernaut on offense this season. He was what all offense flowed through. He had to step up big for the Sharks to even be an okay team. If Erik Karlsson was as good as he was last season, putting up like 50 points in a full year, the Sharks would have been last place, not even close. They would have been like the worst team in the history of the NHL, and yet Erik Karlsson leading the way at 101 points made it so that they were even somewhat competitive, and this already very difficult to watch team at least had some hope and interest surrounding it, as of course just watching Erik Karlsson on the journey to 100 points did give at least a little bit of excitement to these games. And while yes, many will argue, well, his defensive game wasn't particularly good, and that is absolutely true. I'm not going to sit here and argue that Erik Karlsson is some sort of stalwart on defense. He's not even all that good. Like he's more so like average to below average, I would say. But when you put up 101 points in a season, when most of those points, 3/4 of those points, come at even strength, which is even more so impressive, making it almost more impressive than the season than Connor McDavid had. That's my controversial opinion. Connor McDavid puts up over 150 points, but about half of those come on an elite power play featuring other players like Leon Draisaitl and Nugent Hopkins, while Erik Karlsson, 3/4 of his points come at even strength. To me, that's incredibly impressive as a defenseman. So a fantastic season for him, and even if the defense lags behind, I would probably give my Norris vote to him for sure. When it comes to then second place on the team, we did have Logan Couture, who also played the full season for the San Jose Sharks, all 82 games, and I do have to commend Logan Couture for sure, the captain here, and he was usually the experiment for a lot of the controversial lineups that David Quinn would roll out. A lot of the time, first line center Tomas Hertl would be given players like Meyer, players like Barabanov on his wings, while Logan Couture would frequently feature players like Nick Bonino and Kevin Labanc and Noah Gregor on his wings. Matt Nieto as well was a frequent player with Logan Couture this season, and yet he'd still managed to put up 67 points, 27 goals on a pretty offensively anemic San Jose Sharks team. So I definitely have to commend Logan Couture for a very solid all-around season. Then we have Tomas Hertl, 79 games played with 63 points, and it's much more of the same with Tomas Hertl. For about like the third straight season, I would say, Hertl would put up a respectable amount of points. 63 is certainly nothing to scoff at, especially on a pretty bad San Jose Sharks team, but the dominant Tomas Hertl that we saw a few years ago just seems to be all well and gone. At that point, it seems as though that was the exception to the rule, and this is the type of Tomas Hertl that we are just going to be expecting to see. The type of Tomas Hertl who is a top 6 forward. He does pretty good at that job, puts up 60 points, but shouldn't be expected to be dominating the ice like former San Jose Sharks player Timo Meier did for much of this season. So I guess at that point, Tomas Hertl had an okay year, but still, for a player making over $8 million, you're expected to see a bit more than that, especially since, like I said, he found himself on a line with Timo Meier for the vast majority of this season. Timo Meier was playing absolutely lights out, and Tomas Hertl could barely even ride his coattails. Then we have Alex Barabanov, the fourth top 6 forward, I guess, with missed a good chunk of games, especially to end the season. So 68 games played, 47 points. Actually a very solid season for Barabanov. Likely would have been able to be more in the 55-point range, potentially even in the 60-point range if he had actually finished that year and had a few good games. So it'd been very impressive to see Alex Barabanov play. I definitely enjoy him as a player, and when he found some very solid chemistry in the latter half of this season with Logan Couture, that was quite nice to see, because a allowed the San Jose Sharks to go with a slightly more balanced top six. And once the Sharks are able to fill up that top six with maybe more younger players going into next season and the season after that and things of that nature, Barabanov should only rise in terms of point total. Still finds himself relatively young, on the correct side of 30, though is, I guess, getting a bit up there in age. And the major question with Barabanov does become, does he get traded next season? Because he's got 1 year left on his deal as an unrestricted free agent, and he would be a pretty solid pickup for pretty much any playoff team at the trade deadline. So it's really dependent on how good or how bad the San Jose Sharks are next season. And then finally we have Kevin Labanc, who had a pretty up and down season, not only in terms of play, but in terms of actually getting played, as he found himself a healthy scratch pretty frequently this season. 10 games of healthy scratch. I don't think he was ever actually injured at any point this year, just frequently a healthy scratch. Ends up with 33 points on the season. He found himself at times playing on that top line with Timo Meier and Tomas Hertl and doing very well, and at times playing about 5 minutes of ice time on the fourth line. So it was, as I said, an extremely up and down season for Kevin Labanc. I felt as though those last dozen or so games that he played, he did finish off rather strong. Kevin Labanc is also a player like Barabanov, who has 1 season remaining on his contract, but unlike Barabanov, who is extremely movable, Kevin Labanc, unless he performs exceptionally well to start the season next year, will not be insanely movable and will almost certainly be a San Jose Shark for the entirety of next season, as long as he doesn't get bought out, which would be a pretty weird move at this point for Mike Grier to make. So generally, this was a half-decent season for Kevin Labanc, but definitely not living up to that massive contract. But now let us move on to the goaltenders for the San Jose Sharks. The major issue for this team, if they had gotten even average goaltending, they likely would have indeed finished in that more 8th to 9th, maybe even 10th last range in the entire league. So you can almost be thankful that these two goaltenders existed and played as well or as poorly as they did, for the fact that the Sharks will end up with a much better pick because of this. This was led by James Reimer and Kaapo Kähkönen. Reimer would start just a few more games, 12 wins with an absolutely awful goals against average of 3.48, as well as a very equally as awful .890 save percentage. These are just terrible, terrible stats, and yet somehow Kähkönen manages to do even worse than that. 9 wins on the season, meaning he wins about 1 in every 4 games that he started, a 3.85 GAA, very close to 4.0, which is unheard of for a goaltender who started more than 5 games, as well as a .883 save percentage. Both of these goaltenders were amongst the worst goaltenders to even play at more than a handful of games this entire season. I believe in terms of actual goals given up above expected, or below expected, I guess you could say, these two goaltenders were maybe 100th in the league, meaning there's a top 32 goaltenders. Obviously there's 32 teams in the league, so you would expect 32 starters. They're not even in remotely the same conversation as those 32 starters. Then in the next 32, so leading up in the top 64, would be the backup goaltenders. They're not even in the conversation of that. And then the following 32 would be the third string goaltenders, the players or the goaltenders who would get called up from the AHL in case there's an injury, which would be the top 96, and they weren't even in that category. Both of them found themselves just below that, meaning they played below third string level in the NHL this season. Absolutely terrible, awful, just embarrassing seasons for both of these goaltenders. Kähkönen will likely be back with the San Jose Sharks next season because he is under contract. Reimer will almost certainly not be back at this point, just based off of how poorly he did this season. And if we were really looking for one direct answer for why the Sharks were as bad as they were, we really do not need to look any further than their goaltending tandem on the season. But that will do it for this recap. Indeed, the San Jose Sharks, they played terribly through a full 82-game year. It was hard to get through. It felt as though every single game was an absolute slog to watch. 60 minutes of just painfulness as the Sharks would blow every possible lead. In fact, here's an interesting stat. The Sharks held leads in 35 games this season that they would then end up losing, which is an NHL record. So the Sharks, not only were they very bad, but they were also extremely bad at being clutch in ending out these games. They would have 1-0 lead, 2-0 leads, 2-goal leads, 3-goal leads, that they would end up losing the game more so than any other team in NHL history. So it was just a very tough season to get through, but it's finally over and we can hopefully move on to bigger and better things. Class dismissed.